Hey y'all, Matt here, and welcome to our weekly Friday Bible study in the book of Ruth. Today we're going to be in Ruth chapter 2, verses 14 through 23. And the scripture says, At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "This man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Beside, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all of my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you may be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So a quick review on what we talked about last week. What we saw was the Levitical law made it to where the owners of the field, they had to leave grain around the outside of the field in order for the poor and the widow and the orphan, the people that couldn't take care of themselves, to come and be able to pick this grain up so that they would have something to survive off of. But because of the good character of Boaz, he went above and beyond to care for Ruth out of the goodness of his heart. In verses 8 through 10, Boaz offered protection because it could be dangerous for a woman to be out alone in the field. As even Naomi said, he basically told her to stay in his field so that she would be safe. And he also allowed her to drink of the water that he had for the workers. And that way she didn't have to take any kind of risks or extra work or time to go down to the well to gather her own water. But what we see in this new passage this week, in verse 14, we see that Boaz actually goes another step above what he did last week, and actually even invites Ruth to come and eat with him and the workers. This was out of the kindness of his heart, and nothing that we see in these scriptures would hint that he's trying to take advantage of her or has any special interest in her anyway. It appears that he's just doing this out of the kindness of his heart because he's just a good man. He's a godly man. In verse 15, the scripture says, when she went back to work, he told the harvesters to deliberately drop grain on the ground. And what this would do, it would make it easier for her to pick up. She wouldn't have to go around and actually pick it herself, but she would be able to pick it up off the ground. It would help her out. It would take the load off of her. Verse 17, at the end of the day, after working hard in the field and after all of these little favors that Boaz did to help her out and to make her life easier, she actually accumulated quite a bit of grain. The old measuring system that they used in the Bible, a lot of times we don't really know what it means unless our Bible translates it for us. But what she actually ended up with was about 26 quarts of barley. And what this would do, a lot of us, like me included, I don't know how much 26 quarts of barley means, but it's enough that it would feed a man for several weeks, a working man for several weeks. So what we need to take from this is that Boaz has shown her so much favor and generosity that he's given her more than enough food, both for Ruth and for her mother-in-law Naomi. And this is out of the goodness of his heart. He allowed her to have an abundance instead of just struggling to survive. And this is incredible, because how many people would actually allow someone that's poor like this to take an abundance away from their crop that they were making their livelihood off of. If anything, a lot of people would just give the minimum. And then another thing that we see that's going to be very important as this story develops is when Ruth gets back, Naomi asks, "Whose field did you go glean in?" And when she finds out that it's Boaz, the scripture says that Naomi immediately recognized his name as being a family redeemer. And a family redeemer is another cultural thing that we need to dive into, because we don't necessarily have family redeemers in our time period. There were three things that a family redeemer typically was responsible for or did. And all a family redeemer is some kind of a relative of the male part of the family, basically, or the clan. And so Boaz somehow is related to Naomi's husband somewhere in his bloodline. So there's a blood relationship there, and that makes him a possible family redeemer. And so the three things that a family redeemer could be responsible for, if we go back to Leviticus chapter 25, verses 25 through 30, they would be responsible for buying family members back from slavery, or fields back if they had to be sold because they got into such a financial hardship. And this is something we don't necessarily know, but in a great famine or something like that, or even in Naomi's situation where she can't provide for herself, out of desperation, what somebody could do is sell themselves into slavery, so that way they know that they would be cared for. The second function in Numbers chapter 5 verse 8 or chapter 35 verse 12, we see a kinsman or family redeemer could receive restitution on behalf of a deceased relative, or even be responsible for pursuing the killer to make sure justice is served. Neither one of these apply in this case, but this is another function of a family or kinsman redeemer. The third part or responsibility of a family or kinsman redeemer is what is going to pertain to this story. And we're eventually going to see this develop as we keep working along in the scripture. But chapter 25 of Deuteronomy, verses 5 through 10, it lays out how a kinsman or a family redeemer could be responsible for raising a child for the deceased relative so that the property that they had could be inherited. And this is something that a lot of times we kind of lose sight of, because like for instance, if a father dies in a family now, the wife would inherit whatever property they have. There's not really much need for a kinsman redeemer. But in this time period, a kinsman redeemer was vital in a position that Naomi and Ruth are in, because the responsibility of this kinsman redeemer would be to actually take the widowed woman on as their own wife in order to give them kids. And it was a weird situation in our eyes, but these kids would actually be just as though they were the kids of the deceased. So that way the name of that deceased ancestor could continue on, they could inherit property, and that bloodline wouldn't just die with that one person, because the woman couldn't inherit land or anything, if you remember. And then after this, after Naomi recognizes Boaz as a possible kinsman redeemer, scripture doesn't say it, but I'm sure something in her mind was, hopeful that somehow this would work out between her and Ruth. Or between Boaz and Ruth. But as the story develops, we'll dive into that a little bit more. But as we finish chapter 2, we're left with Naomi telling her daughter-in-law that she should definitely stay in the fields under the protection of Boaz as she continues to glean. But I hope you'll join us next Friday as we dive into chapter 3 and we keep working through Ruth. Also, we'll have videos on Monday and Wednesday on other topics. If you need a study Bible and you're local to the area and you don't have one, text me or email me, and I'd love to get you a study Bible. In addition to that, if you have any topics or questions you'd like to see covered on videos, please text me, email me. I would love to put stuff that you're interested in these videos. Until the next one, I love y'all. Blessings.